Welcome to the Integral Stage Sexuality Series. I'm Layman Pascal, and before I host my high-priced week-long workshop on integrative sexuality at a seaside Caribbean resort, I need to make sure I've been fully exposed to the multidimensional richness and profundity of this topic. A topic that most people find deeply physically compelling, emotionally significant, and for some people intellectually fascinating and brimming with spiritual and developmental potential. Here to share the ins and outs of their understanding is... Go ahead and say hi.
Hello there, I'm Jessica Graham.
Hi. Here's where I wanted to start. I love the subtitle of the book, Getting Off Without Checking Out. As I've done some work translating sacred texts, and I often find that colloquial phrases do the best job of tapping into the universal humanity of even very esoteric topics. So then I'm curious about the notion of checking out, though, because there's a number of different ways to think about it. Like checking out could be, we always have presence and consciousness, and then sometimes it's turned off. It could be that when we're checked out, it goes somewhere else and still exists, or maybe it only exists when we're making it and turning it on. What's your take on that?
Well, I would say in order to check out, there needs to be a self, a combination of mental activity, visual and auditory, and emotional sensation, and maybe some purely physical sensation. And certainly there's much beyond that. So in the absolute sense, there is no checking out. Checking out from what? Checking out from what? It's not really actually possible in the absolute sense would be my assumption. But the self and the various aspects of self can definitely check out. If we're practiced, then we notice when that's happening. And we can see, oh, there's this combination of sensation and thought that's creating this sense of contraction, of sort of the walls going up, or the mind getting very narrow.
Good answer. There's no real answer, but it's a great kind of question, I think. In terms of both mindfulness practice and sexuality, how big a danger is perfectionism?
Oh boy, you're speaking to a recovering perfectionist. So I would say perfectionism is quite limiting when it comes to any sort of spiritual practice, including a mindfulness practice, including a secular mindfulness practice. It doesn't really matter, including any kind of practice like learning the piano or learning to play basketball. When perfectionism comes in, again, that's a solidification of a kind of self that actually doesn't allow you to grow so much. You might get a little bit of movement. I think my perfectionism allowed me to take certain steps, but eventually you hit a wall. You can't really get past it because the perfectionism kind of, it turns on you. It starts to, criticize and judge you. It's no longer a motivating force. So certainly when it comes to any kind of practice, perfectionism can ultimately be limiting. When it comes to sex, I don't know how explicit am I allowed to be?
Go as far as you like. You've got a sophisticated audience.
All right. Well, I already sort of avoided where I was going to go with my crassness. So I'll just say perfectionism is, I think, is a turnoff. I think it's a turnoff inside yourself, and I think it's a turnoff when someone else is coming towards you sexually with a perfectionist kind of energy. There's not presence there. That's not to say that we don't want to practice, right? We can become better lovers to ourselves and to others through practice. But when perfectionism is there, I think it kind of locks things up, maybe dries things up. Maybe, doesn't quite allow for the life force to move.
Yeah, it seems to me like both in terms of just having a nice life, but also in terms of treating sexuality as practice, one of the main things you need to be really secure in is the notion that there's a whole multitude of positive outcomes. There's lots of different ways for it to have worked, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, a possibility, right?
Yeah.
It's so interesting because that's been sort of my own personal meditation this week, and in several classes that I taught, has been all about possibility and how, we practice possibility, and oftentimes the possibilities we're practicing are, based on our early conditioning, and they tend to boil down to not good enough, don't have enough, things like this. And we practice those possibilities and end up, creating a belief, and end up creating, a kind of reality on that belief, and totally miss the fact that there are endless possibilities, endless. And sexuality really shows us that. It's just, we get really, we get really dialed into what we think is the right way, or the way that we've always done it. And we miss out on a, endless galaxy of possibilities.
There seem to be two ways to think about the sheer malleability of sexual energy. Sexual energy seems to be able to inhabit a lot of different domains. It seems to spill over from one topic to another. So on the one hand, we could think, yeah, maybe it should infuse everything. But on the other hand, we think, well, maybe a lot of our problems are that it's misplaced and it's gone into the wrong area.
Mm.
That there's a sort of, I don't know if you're familiar with Gurdjieff, but he was a spiritual teacher, had this notion of the wrong work of centers, that that our sexual functioning is being depleted because it's being used by other parts of ourselves. We're using our sexual energy to be political, or we're using our sexual energy at church, or we're using it in other areas, and it's not where it's supposed to be, so it's not really doing its job. But on the other hand, there's this kind of, tantric fantasy of being able to infuse it into every area of life, right? Is sex going into too many areas or not enough areas, in your take?
Well, I definitely experience sexual energy as creative energy. The most creative times in my life have also been the times when I'm, most in tune and alive sexually. And, it goes the other way too. When someone is kind of shut down or blocked sexually, it can feel like it's hard to do much. It can feel like it's hard to create, whether that's, creating an Excel spreadsheet, or whether that's, creating a film. There can be a sense of the sort of a blockage of flow. So I think to be human is creative. We can't help but be creative. And when we are accessing the sexual energy, we are, accessing the creative energy. And so I don't think sexual energy necessarily needs to mean sex, though. I learned a long time ago from a Buddhist nun. I was on retreat, and I was 7 or 10 days in or something. And I had gone through this period of sort of a sexual energy release. So what it looked like for me was basically wanting to fuck everyone all the time. And it was like I was in heat. And I wasn't fucking everyone all the time, but I was having these really spontaneous, full on sexual sort of visions with so many people. And I was in this meditation retreat, and I wouldn't say, well, maybe I was distracted by it. I was feeling some kind of way about it. And so I asked this nun to sit down and talk with me. And she was awesome, because she was like, oh yeah, it took me 10 years to tame that. She's like, I wanted, when I joined the monastery, I was like, okay, well, that's cool. And she said, it's just creative energy. Use it for other things, when you're not actually, engaging with sex, use it for other things. And I just found that so generous, because in Buddhism and in many religions, there can be, a real sort of, inability to look at the positive aspects of our humanity, of our sexuality, which is such a big part of our humanity. And I just loved that she not only shared about herself, but gave me this gift of, you can use this in other ways. So you can be asexual, you can be celibate, and you can still be accessing a sexual / creative energy. I don't tend to think that there's a right or wrong here, though. Sure, there might be some people who really need to be very, very aware of how they're using that energy and where they're using that energy. And there might be other people who it's just easy to just let it flow. And so, I can't speak for everyone, but I think, it's a personal adventure, and you must find out for yourself.
You mentioned an interesting thing there, and I wonder, why do you think so many of the spiritual wisdom traditions have had such difficulty in embracing full spectrum human experience?
Well, when you are a householder and you're engaging with work and money and sex and romantic love and jealousy and anger and lust and all of these things, it's less energy going towards this ultimate sort of intention of liberation, of enlightenment. And it's actually, I think, harder probably ultimately to be a householder. I don't know, because I've never been a monastic, so I can't really say, but I have heard people talk about how, people who have lived that way talk about how in some ways, shutting out all those aspects of humanity make it very easy to have this single pointed intention or focus. I think it's also scary to go into our humanity. It's a real wilderness in there. And I think as humans, we want to be safe. Even those of us who are like, no, I want, full liberation. I want, to let go of all fear. I mean, many times we want to do that because we want to feel safe, on the animal level, and engaging with the ups and downs of humanity. It doesn't feel safe to that human. And, that's, to me, like, wow, what a path to go into that and to ultimately find the unconditional safety that's available to all of us. I've known monastics who are absolutely exploring that wilderness. So don't misunderstand me, but I do think that, another way to think of it is like, if I was not as multi-passionate as I am, I might be really good and successful at one thing. Like I might be like a really great actor, successful actor. I might be like a famous meditation teacher, if I would have put all my energy into one thing, right? But I have it spread out. And I think there's definitely something to be said for limiting attention in one way. And I really like being human. So I don't see myself kind of slicing out those aspects in order to just focus on one version of what awakening can be.
There were two things that really stood out to me in your book that I thought were complementary to each other. One of them was the emphasis on how just paying attention to parts of your experience can help bring change and transformation to those areas. And the other one was this issue of our reluctance to be seen, to have someone look into our eyes in vulnerable moments. And those both seem to suggest attention as almost a material force of some kind. What's your experience of what attention is? Where does it get its power from?
Can you say a little bit more about that?
I mean, I just feel like, on the one hand, paying attention to something in ourselves, in our life, seems to be able to change it in ways that our attempts don't. So it seems more powerful than our attempts. And at the same time, we wouldn't be so reluctant to be seen unless someone else's attention was experienced by us as really powerful. So it's like there's a general impression of attention being a potency in the world. I don't know if it's a question there, but I just wanted to feel you out on the concept of attention.
Yeah, I think it's beautiful. What comes to mind as you share that is this idea of life living through us, and that it's intelligent and it's aware of itself and it's doing exactly what it's doing, and that when we as far as like almost like a non-interference, just allowing these aspects of self to be seen, we create space. And same thing when we're truly seen. It's like this this release of that tension. I don't know, that allows for what's happening to just happen without our resistance. I definitely more and more believe that it's incredibly healing for the human to be seen. Now that can be on our own, just seeing these aspects of self, which has been incredibly healing for me, but it can also be being seen by someone else. And, honestly, that's a big part of what I do as a teacher, is just see people and let them know that I see them. A common thing for me to say is like, I'm right here with you. I see you. So yeah, I'm not sure what else to say as far as the tension goes, but definitely what comes to mind is like, in both of those cases, whether you're seeing yourself or being seen, in this sort of open, non-effortful way, it's a letting go of resistance. It's a moving with the flow rather than against it. Because doesn't reality want to see itself? Like, doesn't all of this just want to love itself and love itself and love itself? I mean, that's my experience.
Yeah, that's what it looks like to me. I don't make an absolute statement about it, but that's certainly how it looks.
It's nice to be here with you and experience that possibility together.
What can I ask? Can I ask another cryptic, ambiguous question?
Sure, I love it.
Okay, let's talk about needs, because you use a phrase a couple times in the book about framing your needs in a collaborative way, which is a beautiful phrase. And when I think about need and sexuality, I have two options. One is like a Maslow's hierarchy idea, where there's different ranges of needs that are legitimate needs. And the other one is all the people who would say, well, eating is a need, but sex isn't a need, right? For them, they're making a strong distinction between needs and wants, which can be clarifying, but can also be pejorative. Dismiss something that's really important to a person as not really being a need of some kind. So what's your general take on needs, and is sexuality a need?
Yeah, well, I think it's interesting. I think really depends. You ask someone who's actually been in true need, I feel like you get a really different answer. I'm like, yeah, I experienced poverty as a kid. We got some food from the church. There was a period of time where we were, on food stamps or welfare or something like that. And so there was need, but I don't know that I ever went, I don't think I ever went to bed hungry. I don't think I ever went to bed without having enough to eat. I have white skin, so I walked around the world not needing to protect myself in a certain way, not needing to be afraid in a certain way, not needing to prove myself in a certain way. And so I think, it's interesting in thinking about needs, for someone who really does just need some food or some shelter. In that case, yeah, I don't know if they would necessarily be thinking as far as like my sexual well-being, And I think some version of sexuality is a need. And it might be when we're in survival mode, and whether that's survival mode because we're living in abject poverty, or because we're in survival mode because we're dealing with anxiety and depression and chronic pain, things like this, all of which I've experienced. The sexuality piece can definitely fall into the background. But I think ultimately, I definitely take kind of the integral view with this. I think it's part of one of the quadrants, and it's I think a necessary aspect. And certainly, on a biological level, like it's a basic human drive. And so I think to deny it is to deny our humanity. And that's not to say that there aren't people who don't need to engage with that part of humanity. Absolutely. But the majority of us do on some level. And, you know, I've seen with people I've worked with where maybe they've been engaging with sexuality, but in such a limited way. And as we start to work and we start to open up and we start to heal and we start to kind of explore the possibilities, there's this sense of like, wow, there's this whole other universe I had no idea was there. And then maybe then it does become a need because you know that it's possible.
Maybe you'd talk a little bit about the role of, I want to say discipline, but maybe a rule of some kind, a temporary rule as a kind of automatic mindfulness factor. In your book, you talk a lot about, you know, taking 6 months or a year off from sexuality. And in a way, many of the same things could come to a person who decided with their partner they were going to have sex every day or something like that. That the institution of these rules for some period of time forces you to see a huge range of things that you might not otherwise be looking at. And that the rule can sort of act as a like an automatic mindfulness practice just by following a rule. It fascinates me.
Yeah, it's interesting because the word rule, it riles up the little feral kid in me. You know what I mean? Like I was, if you took me somewhere, like, I don't know, a daycare or a summer camp or something, and they had a nap time, I'd be like, hell no, I am not going to this. If they told me what I had to do with my body, I was not interested. And, you know, I was on my own very young as well, in charge of myself, responsible for myself, you know, as a young teen. And the idea of anybody telling me what to do. And that's something I've needed to work with. So I share that because just the word rule, it's like interesting, the self that will activate, like, oh yeah, rule. And so I do tend to use the word agreement or intention. And I totally agree with you. Rule can be an incredible tool for mindfulness, sticking to something no matter what. So 13 and a half years ago, I set a 1 day at a time rule, but to not drink. And I haven't. And it's 100% transformed my life and allowed me to go much, much deeper into my practice. Now, if I had gone much, much deeper into my practice 14 years ago, I may not have needed to set that rule. But at that time, I needed it. I needed that structure. And the same thing with when I took a period of celibacy, that structure, that agreement, which, you know, I really do believe in the whole like idea of 1 day at a time. I think it's really hard for most people, the idea that like, this is my rule for 6 months, no matter what. It's easier if like 1 day at a time for 6 months. It just makes it a little more accessible for some, but it can build self-esteem, a sense of confidence in ourselves. It can deepen whatever it is that we're intending. Like for me, like I said in the book, like after that period of time, I got into a relationship that was really very different from anything else. And then I made other agreements with myself during that relationship, which led to, you know, my next relationship ultimately, which was even more different, like even just totally different. And so, yeah, I think those rules or agreements or intentions can be incredibly powerful. And we need to recognize that our wiring is very deep and very old. And, you know, if you've been biting your nails since you were 4 and then you decide to set a rule, I'm not going to bite my nails anymore. Well, probably you're going to bite your nails again. You probably are. You can practice it though. You can practice it and you can practice it and you might do it less and you might do it less. And then, you know, one day maybe you're sitting and you get to the root of what it's really about and something shifts deep inside. And then maybe there's a kind of rewiring and then you keep practicing. But, you know, people respond differently to these kinds of rules. And so it just depends on the kind of person that you are.
Would you say, generally speaking, that your selection of sexual partners has kept pace with your self-knowledge?
Oh, I love that question. Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Without a doubt. I mean, in fact, I remark sometimes, like, even I don't know, 6-7 years ago, the certain people I was engaging with that I wouldn't even consider, wouldn't even be attracted to today. Not because there's something wrong with that person, but because like it's just different orbits, you know, it's just completely different paradigms. They don't, you know, I can love that person, you know, just like there's a sense of love for everything, everywhere, everyone, you know, including like, you know, certain politicians, you know, there's a kind of love there. But wanting to have them inside of my body or be inside of theirs, or, you know, have their spit in my mouth, like, oh, no, because it doesn't make sense anymore. It doesn't fit. So yeah, absolutely. And I would also add that the number of partners and the frequency has changed as well, because I wrote an article once called "Mindfulness Ruined My Sex Life" or something like that. And I would say that I've seen that actually happen a couple times in my life, where there's been a disillusionment around that aspect of my humanity. You know, the cost of awakening is everything, including that, you know, woman who fucked like a porn star, you know, and could do it every day, you know, and wanted to, you know, the sort of the love drugs, the hit that I got off that, and I don't have any problem with us. That's a beautiful, amazing thing. And if we can engage with it in a way that's not destructive for ourselves or others, great, get high all day off of that. But for me, it doesn't really work anymore. And so I have it's just not as much of a priority. Not to say my sexuality isn't. It continues to be a priority. It just looks really different than it did. Yeah. As a result of the continued, you know, adventure of exploration of consciousness.
I really appreciate that there's attention paid to pornography in the book, because it's one of the topics that's often not addressed, you know, under the banner of mindful sexuality. One of the things you brought up is the question of jealousy responses in people relative to someone else's use of pornography. And when I was reading that, I thought about an experience I had on a bus years ago. I was sitting at the back, probably reading Nietzsche or something like that. And this young guy got on, he had this jacket. I started thinking what a jerk this was and how great he thought this jacket was, how attractive he thought this jacket made him, right? And he got off the bus, and I kept looking at these responses in myself, and I realized, wait a minute, I must think that jacket's attractive. Like, I don't know anything about him or his life. I'm the one. I think people are attracted by that jacket, and those people are me. So there's an interesting thing, because on the one hand, jealousy is you know, something you might want to investigate relative to your feelings of worth and your self-image. And on the other hand, jealousy is a bit like desire turned into a knot. And if you could just untangle it and turn it back into desire, which is my bus experience, like, oh, I want that, I realized, rather than having all these tangled projections about hypothetical other people's wantings, which was just strangling me in that moment.
Yeah, it can be so strangling, can't it? Jealousy of any kind, you know, whether that's, you know, a sort of jealousy around someone's possession, or whether that's jealousy about, you know, who your partner might find attractive, or watching porn. Yeah, I mean, when it comes to sexual romantic jealousy, the first place I generally go is abandonment. You know, I think for most people, there's abandonment fear in there. And so that tends to be kind of the first layer that I like to investigate. And usually it's, you know, it's linked up with, you know, childhood experiences. Not always, but usually. But yeah, absolutely. Jealousy can absolutely be a pathway to our actual desire. I think that's a beautiful thing for folks to consider. Like, and I think definitely when it comes to like, I'm thinking about it in terms of like an artist, creative, because that's part of what I do. And when I've noticed that feeling come up about, you know, a job a friend had, or, you know, whatever, something that some sort of success. Ideally, I come right back to that sense of desire, like, oh, I want to creatively express, which tells me like, oh, maybe I'm not doing enough of that. Maybe I'm not connecting to that part of myself enough. Maybe I'm not honoring that artist inside of me. And then I can give that part of me what I need. Just like, I don't know, did you buy the jacket?
No, but I think of it fondly from time to time.
I feel like you need to get that jacket. I feel like it would be like this beautiful full circle experience.
Finally.
It's funny, the things I'm not saying this is the case for you in this jacket, but the things that we don't allow ourselves to have, the little things, like I, for like a couple years, maybe more, wanted a little fanny pack because I take walks and I have chronic pain. And so like, if I take a long walk, I don't want something like on my shoulders, but I don't necessarily even want it in my pockets because it like weighs me down in ways that are painful. And so I've wanted this fanny pack, and for some reason, I waited years. I got one on Etsy for $15, and it's been like brought such joy into my life. And certainly when it comes to our sexuality and to our sexual and romantic life, we do that all the time. It's like all the stuff that we aren't even willing to let ourselves consider asking for, let alone ask for. And a lot of the time we can actually get what we want. A lot of the time. Not always, but a lot of the time. So I definitely think that like allowing that desire to express is just so incredibly important.
It's very strange how much we have to actively remind ourselves that we want what we want and maybe should have that.
Yeah, letting ourselves want what we want, man, it's such a big one. I even just a couple of years back, I was working with a coach, and she identified that. Like, she's like, wow, Jessica, you really don't let yourself want what you want. And it was in terms of, a few specific things. And I just started to realize like how much that permeated my life. And, there's it's a spiral. I probably learned that same lesson 10 years before and 10 years before that, but it occurs in new ways, deeper layers. And yeah, I encourage folks, like, if you sit down and just like let yourself write everything you want, even maybe the things that you don't actually want, like even the things that you're like, I don't know if I actually want this, but some part of me does. So I'm just going to write it down, and then just start there and just like look at it all.
Do you think that positive orientation toward our wants and needs is more like just a skill we need to get better at? Or do you think there's something in us that's actively self-thwarting?
Well, if there's something in us that's actively self-thwarting, it's probably not ours. It's probably some version of intergenerational trauma. It's probably been handed down. We've inherited it. And yeah, I mean, I do think that one of the ways to counteract that is to practice the opposite, practice allowing ourselves to want what we want. But I think also getting really curious about desire in general can be really helpful, because there's different kinds, there's different flavors of desire. And I've definitely, as I've gotten older and started really desiring motherhood, I've been like, wow, this is a really different desire than any of the other desires I've ever felt. Actually really clarified wanting for me. And there's a lot of things that I wanted throughout my life that I absolutely went after, and many cases got. And then I had that, that feeling that any of us who've been on this path know, which is like, you get what you want and you're like, wow, it didn't fill up this empty ghost belly. Like I don't feel how I thought I would feel. And you can start to, yeah, I don't know. For me, I really started to be like, well, what's the point of wanting anything? What's the point? And this arising of desire to be a mom definitely reacquainted me with wanting and introduced me to a version of it that I hadn't yet explored. So we'll see what happens with that.
The clarification of wanting fascinates me. And I kind of want to double back to the porn question, because very often we talk about porn as something that someone else experiences, right? Like people's reactions to someone else's use of porn, whether it's in relationships or even our politics of it is a little bit like that. So there's things that they can work on, but there's also a notion that you could bring intentional practice to your use of pornography. One of the things that I found was increasing attentiveness to nuances in the material, which is also a clarification of wanting, is a fascinating practice. And because it's unlike your actual relationships, because you can review things and go, oh, what I liked is not this person or this section, but actually I like that particular arching, or that like that's very it's more and more precise and more clear each time, which simultaneously makes you more fascinatingly engaged and also sort of emotionally indifferent to it at the same time.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Or you can also become very absorbed in an emotional way as well. It can certainly go either way. I mean, it's interesting in the way that you talk about it. I mean, it really makes me think of like viewing art. I'm just thinking about being in a museum and just sitting on the bench and looking at the big giant abstract and just like zooming in on like, oh yeah, that I don't quite know why, but that 5-inch area, like, whew, it does something. And then maybe then it connects me to a sense of emptiness, and then maybe it brings me right back into form, and it's like this amazing sort of almost sensual dance that happens. And I do think of porn, especially when done well, as art, and absolutely a way to get clarity, and the clarifying of wants, like to get real clarity. Not to mention, porn is a wonderful thing for people who, for one reason or another, are unable to have sex or don't want to have sex. I think a lot about porn in terms of people with various disabilities and chronic illnesses. There's been certainly times in my experience where that's what I'm up for. You know what I mean? Like I'm not up for anything more. And that becomes the sexual expression and the sexual exploration. So yeah, I'm a fan of porn, and I'm also really aware of the damage that it can cause and does cause. And that's why bringing that intentionality, bringing your practice into the viewing of it is so very important. I've definitely given that as homework before. Like, I want you to watch this, masturbate, and be in touch with the thoughts that are arising, be in touch with the emotions that are arising, and then go back to the pleasure, and then come back into like what aspects of self are arising. So I think it can be fun, it can be informative, it can be supportive, and it's all about, how we consume it. And I also think what we consume. I used to be able to just pull up something on Pornhub, and I just literally can't. It's the same way that I can't eat certain things because of how how an animal is treated. I just can't do it anymore. And I am pretty passionate about helping people transition into ethical porn, and it does exist, and it's all kinds. It's not just like, people sometimes have the idea that ethical porn is just one version, but it's not. You can get real rough, nasty, kinky stuff, and it's ethical, and sometimes more so because of the level of consent that's required for that kind of material.
Consent is a very interesting phenomenon. I like your emphasis in the book on the difference between no means no and yes means yes. But I think about consent in a very broad way. Years ago, I had a Buddhist master who was very good at energy work. He seemed to be able to control the output of a certain kind of stimulation to other people. And I was very surprised at that time to go and sit in a circle with a kind of a witch woman who asked us all to agree, essentially, to allow energy to flow. And the combined effect of the group seemed to be pretty much the same as the concentrated effect of the individual master. Mm. I was very curious that these were not people who'd, like he had, done years of intentional energy work practice. They were just a group of self-selected random people who agreed to be energy conduits. Mm. So it seems like the range of things that consent can allow is extraordinary. That, you know, even some of our most superlative human potentials can be engaged merely by agreeing. I love that.
I do too. Oh, you're so speaking my language. It's like, yeah. And we oftentimes agree to things that are not so great, you know, like, and I don't just mean sexually. I mean, we make the agreement that like, I am this way. I agree that I'm this way. I agree that you are that way. You know, it's like, I agree that we're these solid separate things. And so on, you know, I agree that I'm bad with money, or I agree that like I'm in pain all the time, or whatever it is. And it's powerful, you know, and it's certainly, ideally, we're practicing it the other way. And yeah, it's amazing in a group, the sort of synergy, the coherence that can happen when everyone's in agreement about what we're doing. I love that. I love working with groups. That's one of the reasons why, is just that energetic quality that can unfold.
There's a phrase you use toward the end of the book, emotional incest. Mm. And it just fascinated me because it wasn't something I'd really put any thought into before I read the term. And it immediately conjured, you know, a visual, visceral, you know, energetic narrative of how these things might go. But maybe you'd talk a little bit about what you mean by emotional incest.
Yeah. So it's the idea of, to put it simply, of a child standing in as a partner, being given information that's not really what I would say is appropriate for a kid. It could be, you know, a kind of affection that just really kind of crosses the line, but doesn't cross the line to the point where you would call it incest or sexual abuse necessarily. Dependence on a child, you know, making your child your confidant. In my case, you know, I was my dad's drinking buddy, you know, I mean, I think maybe earlier than maybe 13, 14, you know, we started drinking together, you know, and like buddies. It was very intimate. We would sit in the car and drink and like listen to, you know, really sexually charged Led Zeppelin songs, and nothing sexual ever happened between me and my dad. And my dad, you know, if he was still alive, he'd be horrified to hear me even like suggest anything close to it. But absolutely, it was emotional incest, you know. And I had a similar, you know, in similar experiences, you know, with my mother as well. You know, it's like they were both young and they both came from a lot of trauma. And I was the first kid, and I was given a lot of information. And that put me in a position of a kind of responsibility that I was much too young to be holding. And while there wasn't sexual abuse, physical sexual abuse, it has the same impact. So when I started really doing my sexual healing work, I treated myself as someone who had been sexually abused. Now, I had had some sexual trauma in my life, but you know, not by my parents. And but I still addressed it in the same way because it was affecting me in the same way. And, you know, it's all relative. Someone else might have a really different experience. But for me, it manifested in, you know, checking out sexually, for example, you know, not wanting to be in my body, or being in my body, but in a very limited way. It's something, you know, that term is something that I've seen change lives. Because so many people have this idea of, you know, well, that didn't happen to me, so I don't have a right to feel what I'm feeling. It's not justified. The behaviors I may be addicted to, or the the self-hatred that I have, it's not justified, because I didn't go through what these other people went through. And to introduce this idea of emotional incest, yeah, I've just seen people have big shifts as a result, you know, to be able to have a new kind of compassion for themselves.
What's your impression then of the art of negotiating sexual topics with children, right? Because it's going to change from person to person and from age to age, and there's responsive and there's proactive ways to try to inform them about things, and it all seems fraught with all this social charge. Obviously, there's too soon for certain kinds of intensities and themes, but at the same time, you have to try to communicate as much wisdom as you can for all the areas of life that might be pertinent.
Yeah. I think the number one suggestion that I tend to give is let the child lead. You know, the child's asking you questions, answer those questions. And if they ask another question, you know, you can answer another question. But sometimes there can be this tendency of like, oh, if they ask me about this, then I have to like tell them everything, or, you know, something along those lines. And you can let the child lead. The child's going to ask questions to a certain point, and then they're going to be like, okay, and they're going to go back and play. I think I tend to err on the side of like maybe more information than less when it comes to what's appropriate to share. I think, you know, it's a natural part of us as humans. It's how that kid is here, you know? And so, you know, not for everyone. Some people come into the world in not necessarily through heterosexual penetrative sex, but, you know, it's like in general, that's where most of us are coming from. And so I think, you know, withholding that is yeah, I can say I have folks I've worked with who weren't given any information at all. And that is damaging. That's something you then have to do a lot of work around. I think it's just as, maybe more damaging, but just as damaging as getting too much information. I got too much, I think. Like I got a lot. I knew a lot about sex, and that got me into trouble as a kid. It got me sort of ostracized, and, you know, angry parents because of what I knew, and the other kids didn't. And so that's also problematic, but, you know, it's also part of what led to who I am today and my ability to help others with that. But I think let the kid lead, and soothe yourself, you know, because it's going to be, for a lot of parents, it's going to be scary. It's going to bring up a lot. Soothe yourself, calm your own nervous system, and find grounding. Because if you go into that conversation all hyped up on stress chemicals, all kind of like, you know, freaked out, then that you're passing that along. It's like sex and stress go together, sex and fear go together. I think the other thing that you can do around kids and sex is very early on start teaching consent. You know, do not force your kid to hug Aunt Martha. Never force a kid to give someone a hug or a kiss. You know, teach kids that their bodies are their own, and you know, let them wear what they want to wear. You know, let them, you know, maybe within reason. You know, like if your kid just wants to be naked all the time, like there's going to be some places where it can't be. And you teach a child that. Same thing with early exploration and masturbation. You know, give them a place where they can do that. Like we don't do that at the dinner table, but you can go in your room and do that. It's your body. You get to explore it. So I'm very, very much like in the sex positive realm when it comes to educating kids about this. And obviously, I think we need a giant overhaul of sex education, and that part of that includes talking about pleasure. So I think it's also really, really important when the kid's at the appropriate age, and that's going to be different for different kids, but as soon as possible to talk about sex in terms of pleasure, not just in terms of making babies. You know, it's actually something that's supposed to feel good.
That's an enormously missing piece of developmental curriculum in general. I remember my sex ed classes, and there was no discussion of having a good time, but there was no discussion of having a good time in anything. They didn't tell you how to have a nice time with science, or a beautiful time with math, or, you know, how to drink appropriately or get a massage, or there was no emphasis on hedonic experience at all. And yet the absence of that is such a depressing factor in almost everyone's life.
Well, yeah, in our
like
relationship,
core education.
Yeah, I agree. And our relationship with pleasure is so screwed up as a result. We're pleasure seekers. We're going to seek pleasure. We just end up doing it like shrouded with shame, or, infused with addiction. It's like we don't know how to engage with pleasure in a way that's actually fueling us and feeding us and helping us kind of be a light in the world. When you have a relationship with pleasure, that a healthy relationship with pleasure, it changes how you move through the world, and that changes the world.
When you get an unexpectedly good pleasure, there's this tendency to get locked into trying to repeat it, which is a problem both on the meditative path and also on the sexual path. Some of my own consciousness transforming experiences when I was younger were so amazing. I kept trying to do the practice that I was doing that I thought led to them.
Mm-hmm.
And eventually I had to tell myself, I called it the 1 millionth customer fallacy. You walk into a store, there's balloons and rewards, and they give you a treat. And later you think, well, if I just go back into that store, it'll happen again. But it didn't happen because you went in that door that day. It happened because hundreds of thousands of other people also went in that door in other days for months, and the corporations involved. There's all these factors that aren't determined by what you did immediately before it occurred.
Mm-hmm.
What's a good approach to appreciating the value and the satisfaction that we continue to get from a peak without getting locked in trying to replicate it?
Well, so one piece is that we have a strong practice around what actually creates a self that's experiencing that pleasure. Now that will change your relationship to pleasure, but it is a way to assure that you don't get attached and tangled up. So what's experiencing the pleasure? Well, it's this body. These are moving, changing, and permanent sensations, and there's maybe something occurring in the mind in regard to it, though in peak states of pleasure, maybe not, and in peak spiritual experiences, maybe not to a certain extent, depending on what the experience is. But to recognize that's what's happening, that there's a me here that's having this experience, and that me can actually be deconstructed into just strands of impermanent phenomena. So that's helpful when it comes to not getting too attached. I was really lucky because I had teachers that just kept being like, no big deal. I was like, so last night I was meditating, and then suddenly there was this bright white light, and it was everywhere. And then the whole room was filled with these werewolves, and I thought they were going to scratch me, but then an angel came. Like full on like hallucinations, or like, various extreme peak states of oneness, or no self and stuff like this. And they would always be like, yeah, no big deal. Sometimes they'd give me like, yeah, that's part of the classical path, because I knew nothing about any of this when I started. I had not studied Buddhism or spiritual awakening or anything. So I like stumbled into things, and they'd be like, oh yeah, that's this. And I'd be like, oh, that's the bliss and the void. I was like, okay, cool. But they also like really grounded me and didn't allow me to get attached. It was always like, just deconstruct it. So one of the things my teacher Shinzen says, he talks about, the power realms, the intermediate realm where all the, the magic stuff is, and shamanic and all of that, and psychic abilities, etc. But that you don't want to, if you're looking at this body of water, that's like just one layer underneath of consciousness. And you can kind of move horizontally. Yeah. For some reason, I always get horizontally and vertical confused. I did not go to school at all. I didn't go to college. I went to very little high school. And there are certain things that people just learn, and it's just normal. Like, I know this thing. I don't know the things. And so like, I have to like pause. So you don't want to work horizontally. You want to keep going vertically. You want to keep going down to what Shinzen talks about as the source. Then if you want, come back up, use the power realms for good. And so this idea of deconstructing those experiences isn't to say that they can't actually be of benefit. And they can also be very motivational for people, but they can be addictive. I've seen people get addicted to peak states the same way we get addicted to heroin. And so the deconstruction of those experiences is a really important aspect of it. And perhaps connecting to, why am I doing this? Like, why am I actually doing this? If I'm doing this just to have a good time and feel good, well, I could just take drugs for that too. I mean, there's a limit to where that'll take you as well. But why am I actually doing this? Am I actually looking for truth and liberation? Am I actually looking for a true, intimate connection with a partner, or with myself, or with multiple partners? Or, am I just kind of, spiritually or sexually kind of jerking off, like, am I just like, wow, okay. And so connecting to the why, I think is really important. I will say that there is one thing that I found that can be recreated, which is the jhanas, and that I'm by no means an expert, but I've sort of taken myself on my own journey with it, and I've seen that, and perhaps it's me, perhaps that's just part of how I'm wired, but I've definitely found that those are repeatable, which is actually kind of nice. It's kind of nice to have something that's repeatable in all of this uncertainty. And at least so far, I'm sure that could change, but at least so far they've been repeatable.
Okay, shout out to the jhanas. I'm thinking about taboo. And, historically and still today, people's sex lives are often sort of circumscribed by the sense that there's cultural taboos around various activities. And there's different human takes on those. Like, here's your multiple choice test. A, taboos, whether we understand them or not, reflect an ancient wisdom that we might not realize, and that even if it doesn't feel good to us, we should try to obey the taboo. Option B, the taboo is ridiculous. We never needed it. It describes something that's actually a completely normal activity. Option 3, the taboo is valuable precisely because it is taboo, because of the concentration and energy and growth that is possible in transgressing. Or D, all of the above.
I definitely don't tend to lean towards the first one, and that might come back to my own, like I said, feral kid. I don't tend to lean towards that one. I think the others, certainly, for me, it kind of comes back to consent. It's like, it's a taboo to have sex with an animal. And I believe that's a taboo that we, in my opinion, should obey, should not transgress, because that animal can't give consent. It's something actually, it is something that really bothers me, like the idea of that. And I know that there are people who really believe their relationships with their animal, that they're connected in such a way that they know the animal is in consent. But I don't think so. That's my opinion. I think the taboo of, anything that involves non-consensual activity is one that wants to be followed. So maybe A for that, like maybe the ancient wisdom, of don't cause this suffering, this potential suffering. The rest of them, I mean, the only rules that I have for sex are that it's consensual. That's really it. So someone posed to me one time, trying to kind of stir up an argument on a Facebook thread. They were like, so if you believe that like people should be free, blah, 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 what about consenting brother and sister? I said, well, actually, if they're consenting, I don't have a problem with it. I think, there's perhaps something going on there, potentially some psychological things happening there. And there are issues around having children together. But as far as their sexual or love connection, I cannot call that wrong if it's consensual. Again, like consensual, I don't know. Maybe they were, maybe they developed in such a way based on a certain kind of trauma that this is what they think they want and they don't really. But I can't get in there and know. And so even when it comes to taboos at that level, I tend to say, hey, are these consenting adults? Great. Have fun. Have at it.
A lot of people think about sexual energy in terms of a polarization. right? Often symbolized by male and female. But it's not so clear when you work with homosexual or trans people or androgynous people or celibate people that it's polarized in that classical sense, and yet we instinctively seem to reach for the symbolism of masculine and feminine polarization in order to describe it. Do you think it is a polarized energy, and do you think masculine and feminine are an adequate way to think about what sexual energy is in an archetypal sense?
I definitely think that using the words masculine and feminine don't really work at this point. I think it's it's limiting. When I first started getting interested in bringing my spirituality into my sex life, that's really all I could find was that stuff. And, I'm not straight. And I know lots of people who don't identify as, any gender. I didn't relate. And several years later, when I started exploring it a little bit, I saw, oh, wow, this stuff works. And if I'm in a heterosexual relationship, it actually, with a very sort of traditionally masculine guy, it works. And for me, it's not worth it. For me, it just doesn't feel right. It feels like it's too binary. It's too dualistic. Now, Tantra teachers, which I'm not, there's really great ones that are really inclusive and really able to speak to all aspects of gender and sexual orientation and all of that. But I will say this, anything, including the way that I talk about spiritual awakening, is mind, is a story. And so when we identify with any of these paths or these traditions or these techniques, not to say they can't all be helpful, but it's sort of the opposite of the point, I think. And so use Tantra and Neo-Tantra as a way to grow and awaken and evolve, but don't get stuck there, because there's just more available. I've been thinking about it a lot, actually, because I have a number of colleagues who are very much of that school. They were maybe trained by a Neo-Tantra teacher, women who talk a lot about like pussy magic and, the feminine, the divine feminine and all of this. And I love it. It's beautiful. And I've almost been thinking like, maybe I need to brand myself as the opposite of that for all the people that are not interested in that. I don't know. I probably won't do that, but I've been thinking about that lately. How for me, like even the idea of feminine, like I've always fully identified as a woman. I would never want to be a man. Like there's no part of me that wants to have a penis, and I don't relate to the kind of feminine that I hear a lot of these kinds of teachers talking about. I don't relate to it at all, and I for a while thought there was something wrong with me. Like I was like, oh, I'm just shut off from that part of me. I'm like, no, I'm just this unique expression. This is just how I express. And I like to play with it too. I found great healing in working with divine mother energy, in cultivating this connection with a divine, all loving, all good mother energy, which is a feminine energy, and drawing it into my body and letting it like go into the places that needed healing. And I didn't translate a belief system into it. I just used it because it worked. And so I don't tend to be black and white about any of this stuff. But I will say, like, for people who want to explore sexuality, but are not drawn to that, like, make your own path, or find people who are talking about it in different ways. It's not the only way to talk about sex and spirituality. It is not.
It's making me think about sexuality and language, which is very interesting. But I kind of want to ask a question like, if a couple wanted to make their sex life into more of an intentional practice, they wanted to explore it together, what kind of conversations do you think they should have had before that?
So one exercise that I really like giving to couples is to sit down and write down all your rules. That word again. Write down all the rules you have in your relationship. And those are the rules that are explicit and the rules that are like unspoken. And that's very illuminating because oftentimes a couple has a rule that neither of them actually agree to. Neither of them want, they just assume the other one does. And so it's a rule. So to take time to really look at that, just like you might go inside yourself, you know, and take inventory of your sort of beliefs about yourself, you do it within the relationship and you really write it out and you look at it together and you talk about it. That's one. I think, you know, another is to have a conversation, certainly around consent. You know, that's an ongoing conversation, but really continuing to clarify that with each other, super important, because it's so easy to cross boundaries when you start exploring this stuff, whether that's exploring sexual energy together or exploring non-monogamy or whatever it is. It's just so easy, and it's going to happen most likely when you start to get into this uncharted territory. You're gonna hit like an iceberg, and it's gonna hurt like hell, and then you get to talk about it and you get to keep talking about it. I'm a big fan of imago dialogue. You familiar with that?
No.
It's just it's a style of kind of conflict resolution developed by Harville Hendricks and his wife, whose name is escaping me at the moment. But it's just a way, it's a structure to have conversations. So I think that's another thing, like have a conversation about how you have conversations. Like, how are you going to talk about it when somebody feels like a boundary was violated? You know, how are you going to take care of each other in that? How are you going to do repairs? I think all of that's really important. Expectations, getting clear on what are my expectations? Am I willing to let go of some of these expectations and just be in the unknown and in the mystery with this person? I also think it's important to talk about getting support, whether that's like a coach or a therapist or, even just a community of other people who are doing what you're doing. I think support is so important. Community of some kind, is so important, even when it comes to something as intimate as sexuality.
One of the interesting things about the integral quadrant model is that it opens up this question about whether or not there's agency in each of those zones, Yes, there's agency we think there's agency in our minds, but maybe there's agencies in our social system, and maybe there's agency in our mutuality as well. So when people come together, very often when they're sexual partners, it seems like they can get to a place where there's a third force or a third entity that seems to be a real player in their relationship with each other to some degree. How do you feel about those, the experiential third? Is it really playing a role, or is it just an epiphenomenon?
Or is it just all there is? I mean, like, honestly, like my partner is a PhD in philosophy, so he could talk free will all day, I'm sure. I experientially tend to lean towards, we have very little agency in the sense that we'd like to think that we do, or that we think that we do. We have does a wave have agency in the ocean? I mean, in a sense, but in another sense, not at all, not at all. And so definitely more and more in recent years, I don't really feel like I'm doing it. I don't really feel like, even like the so-called mistakes that I make or the achievements that I have, it doesn't really feel like it's me. And that's not to say that I'm then, that whole non-dual thing of like, well, there's no one here doing it. So there's, I can do whatever I want, No, I think continue to refine the human, continue to refine that beautiful wave, but also know that you are part of something much, 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 much bigger. And it's going to do whatever the hell it does. So it's tricky to talk about, because, I don't have the philosophy degree, but I do have the experience of more and more and more. There's just a kind of like the human just trusts. And then I keep refining the human anyway.
Let's talk a little bit about what human bodies require in order to be ready to have a good sex life. I think everybody knows they should be doing Kegel exercises or something like that. But beyond that, in terms of sleep, in terms of diet, in terms of how your body's able to operate, what are your general thoughts on, the physical life practice that supports a good sex life?
Well, water and sleep. I think we know that those two things are really important. Maybe low refined sugar intake, and some sort of movement, some sort of physical movement. That could be anything from CrossFit to very gentle stretches on the floor. There's not a right way. It's like besides those basics, I think. I think a big aspect of a good sex life, maybe the most important one, is self-love and self-compassion. So what I try to do, not perfectly, but what I try to do is eat with self-love and self-compassion, move with self-love and self-compassion, choose my projects and my friends and my colleagues and my lovers with self-love and self-compassion. Generally, if that's the intention, then the things that I'm doing are probably giving my body and my mind what I need to have a great sex life. I got in trouble for saying this at one point in a talk that I gave. Right when my book came out, I really hit an all-time low with my health. And what I said when I gave this talk was, I just want to lead with vulnerability. Before I wrote this book, I could fuck like a porn star, and now I had multiple partners and fucked like a porn star, and now I hardly have sex at all, and I can't be nearly as athletic as I used to be. And so, what a good sex life looks like will change as your body changes, whether that's dealing with illness or injury or age or whatever else, depression or not having a partner at the time. And so I think the ways in which we take care of our bodies and our minds also have to evolve and be fluid and grow and change with us. But yeah, the idea that there's like the perfect exercise or the perfect diet, I don't really subscribe to that. I think we're unique, and there's some general things like sleep and water and not a lot of sugar or processed foods. Other than that, self-love and self-compassion, I think, are the main ingredients.
The integration of the energy of aggression is a tricky thing. I think I remember reading in Alexander Lowen's book, Bioenergetics. I don't know if you're familiar with him. He was a student
I know the book,
years ago.
Mm-hmm.
He talked about sexuality as requiring sensitivity and aggression simultaneously, in the sense of being able to be vulnerable and receive and feel, but also being able to reach out, to be active, to be assertive, to reach past where you feel a boundary might be. What's your take on the role of aggression, or any synonym for aggression that might have a more benevolent resonance for you?
Yeah, when we talk about reaching past boundaries, I think for someone who's really in touch, really skilled with subtle energy, they can reach past boundaries to a certain extent with the right conditions. A spiritual teacher or healer who's really good with it and reaches past those boundaries with a student or a client or something, very different. But in a consensual, romantic, sexual relationship, there's absolutely room for reaching past boundaries. There's also room for making an agreement. Like, I want you to reach past my boundaries. And if you reach to a point that doesn't feel good, I'm going to say pineapple, or in my case, cable car. But I think, but I do think that in order to reach past boundaries, there needs to be a kind of trust, and there needs to be a kind of skillful action and mindfulness. I think there are a lot of people I come in contact with who would like a bit more aggression in the positive sense from their partners. even if it's a submissive kind of aggression, I do think that, we like extremes. We do like going in a safe way, going past our boundaries, if we know we're safe to do so. And then certainly, for some people, that's the kink, is to feel unsafe. And that's, that for me, that changed. For me, that definitely used to be a kink, and it changed. It's not really how I feel anymore, but it was true when it was true, and I honored it. So yeah, I think there's absolutely a place for this kind of positive aggression. There's also a place for fantasy, like there's a lot of women in particular who have a rape fantasy, who feel really ashamed about it. But what if you just let yourself embrace that and played it out with your partner, or played it out in your own mind, in your own fantasy? It doesn't mean that that's what you want. It doesn't mean that that's actually what you want to have happen. I think that there's a lot of room for that. Same thing for someone who really wants to be dominated, but has insecurities about what that means, and that's for people, that can be for people of all genders, what that means about them. But it comes back to the wanting what you want, I think.
Yeah, when you were saying that, I was thinking about, boundaries are thresholds, and seems like there's a virtue in being able to skillfully bypass a threshold, whether it's in the world or it's just your own feeling threshold. But there's also this nuanced skill of abiding more subtly at boundaries. And I think a lot of people who, I'm imagining the person who dies of autoerotic asphyxiation. Seems like they overshot the mark. That was not the result they were hoping for.
Right.
But instead of being able to feel the intensity more subtly at that edge of their experience, they thought they had to push further past that edge to get to that experience. Mm-hmm. And it almost seemed like it's a lack of the subtlety of being at that threshold that they're suffering from.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. It is there's a delightful discomfort there, and we just tend to resonate with the discomfort. And it's like, I don't want to be here in this uncomfortable place. I need to push through to whatever's on the other side of this. But acclimating and developing a taste for that space, that threshold. That's hot right there. That is super hot. And it's also what allows us to grow, because I don't know whether we're talking sexual awakening or spiritual awakening or just self-development. It doesn't happen in these giant leaps. Like, I was just saying to my partner the other day, like, man, am I just sick of transformative experiences. Because I had recently seen this healer, and it was great, and I always have big experiences. It's even now. And he was asking me about it. I was like, yeah, it's cool. But I was like, I'm just so sick of transformative experiences. They're great, but they don't, it's so much more meaningful to me anyway, to just have that little teeny tiny shift, that little opening to possibility just a little bit. And I think it's the same idea with these thresholds. I know for me, when I really decided to embark on conscious non-monogamy, because I did a lot of, unconscious or ethical or unethical. I did a lot of unethical non-monogamy. When I decided to embark on it, there was this part of me that's like, all right, I gotta just do it, and man, did I traumatize myself, it was not necessary. It was not necessary that I did it that way. And, there was a lot of repair I had to do as a result. And so whatever it is that one is embarking on, and certainly when it comes to anything regarding sexual boundaries, go slow. And like you said so beautifully, hang out at that threshold and just be there and start to be able to taste the subtleties, because those subtleties can become very significant. Those subtleties can become very strong as you start to develop a taste for them.
You use the phrase delicious discomfort. And this idea of getting a taste for those things at those thresholds. And that's something that seemed to stand out to me in the book, because the book sort of has a structure there's this first person who's got this sex life and this drug life and all this stuff. And then there's this other person writing the book who's this mindfulness teacher now on this other side. But those characters seem to be joined in a continuum of leaning into intensities, right? Whether they're experiential intensities or whether it's the mindfulness practice of just being ready to show up for the thoughts and feelings and experiences as they arise. Do you see that pattern in your own life?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I've had to learn to kind of, I want to say pull back, but that's not exactly right. I've had to learn to kind of soften around that tendency a bit. Chronic illness and chronic pain is a great teacher. I had to start to really be a lot more kind of gentle with myself. And I really, one of the ways I learned that was through learning about somatic experiencing, the work of Peter Levine, and getting my own personal experience with that. And, I'm not certified in it, but I'm very inspired by it in my work. That, yes, lean in, but you don't have, like you were saying before, you don't have to lean past that threshold. And it took me a little while to learn that, because I was used to exclusively doing that. Exclusively being, pushing past the threshold, exclusively being in extremes, like from the time I was very, very young. And so there was for me, there was some unlearning, but I'm really grateful for that part of me too, because, the way in which reality really changed as a result, I would never take that back. I wouldn't want to go back to sleep, and now I know a different way. Yeah. Now I know a really different way of working with boundaries and thresholds and extremes. And I have a different understanding of what leaning in means. It's like leaning in and also having a huge amount of resource, creating such a sense of safety while you lean into those places. And also, I'll also say there's just a lot less material. There's only so much of this sort of stuff, and that's good news when we're talking about trauma. It's like, if you work with it, you are not going to forever stay in an acute state or a low level state of fight, flight, freeze, fawn. Like, it will change. And I'm proof of that. And many people I know are proof of that. Like, when I used to go on meditation retreats, it would be like a combination of like a horror show and like a spiritual revival. It was wild, the things that would happen when I went in on retreat. And now it's like, there might be some tears, but they're like tears of just like pure love and joy. I just like my last retreat right before pandemic, I was on retreat for a couple of weeks, and it's just like it just felt good the whole time. Like, there were some moments where I worked with like little bits of material, but there's just so much less. There's so much less after a bunch of years of sitting with it. So there's that too.
Lovely. We're probably getting to the length of time we could reasonably expect a person to watch or listen to this. Is there anything else that I haven't asked or prompt that you'd like to say on these topics, or anything coming up for you or anything like that?
No, just a lot of gratitude. This was just really enjoyable. I have a lot of these conversations, and this is definitely in the top of them. So it was just really, really enjoyable to connect with you. And yeah, I always like to offer, when I do these, if anybody who's listening wants to get in touch, I have some practices that I'm happy to gift. So if any of the viewers or listeners, want a guided meditation practice, just contact me through my website and ask me for it, and I'll send you something.
Terrific. Well, I appreciate this. It's been very smooth and delightful and bright and friendly.
Oh, good. I'm glad. Not how I would have been described in the past, let me tell you.